Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCullum, and I'm here today in Bern, Switzerland, visiting the Swiss Shooting Museum and taking a look at a couple of the really cool, tremendously rare Swiss prototype rifles that they have not just in their collection, but actually on display here. Today, we have a Type 2 Stamm-Saurer rifle. Now, I did a previous video on Hans Stamm's first semi-auto rifle, and this dates to like 1902. If you haven't seen that, it's an interesting video to watch, well, on its own, but it's also interesting to compare that rifle to this one. So when we pick up this story, Stamm's first attempt to build rifles has failed. The company he worked for has decided to stop working in the field. Stamm quits, and he goes looking for other work in the firearms, or at least in the heavy industry business. In 1907, he gets hired by a company owned by a guy named Adolf Saurer. Saurer is a heavy industry company that's been around since the 1800s. At this point, 1907, they're actually making trucks. They're a company making very early motor vehicles. They're still around today, by the way. They were purchased by Oerlikon back in 20 years ago. At any rate, Saurer has decided to open its own weapons development, weapons production branch. They spent a couple years, like 1903, 1904, they'd started making parts on contract for Swiss military rifles, and they decide they want to get more into that line of business. So they set up the division, they hire Stamm, and he's in charge of their firearms division, and with him they have 2 gunsmiths and 4 other employees and an apprentice, so there's like 8 guys in total, and Stamm gets right to work designing a rifle. Now, he actually starts by working on some bolt-action rifles for the new Swiss procurement. Eventually, the Swiss adopt the K11 and G11 rifle and carbine, developed by Waffenfabrik Bern. Saurer doesn't get the contract, and in 1910, while they're still working on bolt-action rifles, Stamm starts working on a semi-auto. And this is a long recoil, a remarkably complicated long recoil action. The project doesn't really fully take off until about 1912. That's when their first functional prototype is made. And then between 1912 and 1913, they make another 7 rifles, including this specific one. They send one to the Swiss to try and promote it. They send one to the Belgians. They make a version specifically in 7.65 Mauser caliber for the Belgians. But of course, war is on the horizon, and that's not going to bode well. But before we talk about what actually happened to these, let's dive into this thing and take it apart. It's very complicated. All right, this is a relatively clean rifle from the outside, and it's in beautiful condition, by the way. So we have a safety that doubles as a significant dust cover here on the side. When that flips up, the bolt can't move, and it closes off all of the openings there in the receiver. Unfortunately, the magazine for this one is missing. This had a blind Mauser style magazine to it. We don't know exactly what caliber this one is in, but almost certainly 7.5 Swiss. We have a stripper clip guide up here on the top. The front sight is nicely Swiss. It's a good crisp square post. You've got checkering down here to prevent glare on the front sight. And then our rear sight graduated out to 2,000 meters, adjustable there, battle sight 0 of 300 meters. And then this is a long recoil action. So if I don't do anything with the trigger and I just pull the bolt back, the barrel stays forward, the bolt is going to rotate to unlock, and I can pull it open to manually cycle around, clear malfunctions, anything like that. Now, when you pull the trigger, it drops a latch that allows the barrel to recoil. So once I've pulled the trigger and fire, the barrel is going to cycle back. You can see it moving right there. So the barrel comes back, which is going to, we've got, long recoil guns are really hard to demonstrate without actually shooting them, but you can see that the barrel has reciprocated back in here. It comes back with the bolt locked in place until it's reached the end of travel. Then the bolt stops, the barrel goes forward, then the empty case ejects, and the bolt goes forward and locks a new round into place. So that's the gist of the long recoil system. Now let's dig into taking this guy apart. We're going to start out here at the muzzle end, where we actually begin by taking this out. This is just a captive end plug. Take that out. That allows us to pull off the end cap. There was quite a lot of work that went into making that component for sure. Next, I'm going to take off the barrel band. We have retaining springs on both sides. There we go, there's that. With the barrel band and the nose cap off, I can slide the front handguard off. There's not really anything special going on there. Now I'm going to take the trigger guard out so that we can take the stock off. There we go. There's our floor plate and trigger guard. And now the stock just lifts off the action. So once again, there's a lot of fancy woodwork going on here at the back, but other than that, there's not really anything specific or unique to the stock. Note that on this rifle, we have this flat-based pistol grip. As Stamm would continue to develop different versions of the gun, he was mostly changing details like the sights and the furniture. So this is actually a distinctive element of the second pattern. Now you can see a little bit of what's going on under here. So we have a guide rod that goes from the muzzle all the way back into the receiver here. That guide rod comes all the way back into here, and it's actually locked in place by the front trigger guard screw going in there. All right, so one of the key characteristics of a long recoil gun is that you need one spring, one return spring for the barrel, and a separate return spring for the bolt. And normally these are, nested one inside the other, or one's located around the barrel and one's located behind the bolt. Stamm did this interesting thing here where he has both springs parallel and actually sitting on the same guide rod. All right, so what happens here when I pull the trigger to release the barrel is going to reciprocate backwards like that. When it goes backwards, it's compressing this spring because this lug right here is attached to the barrel and it slides on the guide rod. So this is the barrel return spring. A little farther back, we have an operating rod. It's right here and it runs through the receiver and connects to the bolt and bolt handle right there. It is simultaneously compressing this spring as it moves back. You can see this lug on the barrel actually interferes, it stops, it acts as a block for this lug on the op rod. So when I pull the bolt back, I'm going to separately compress the rear spring like that. So let me take this a little farther apart and then we'll look at the mechanics a bit more. So I can pull off the front recoil spring and its stop. Since I have the screw out here, I can actually slide the entire guide rod off the gun now. It's actually going to slide out quite easily. Then we can take off the rear recoil spring. We have this counter buffer spring right there and the center piece that it sits in. So now the guide rod slides out of the op rod. There is one little tiny screw here connecting the bolt handle to the bolt. We take that screw out and then I can lift the bolt handle right up off of this extension from the bolt. The rear end cap screws off. It's held in place by a little spring-loaded detent there. So I push that in, then I can unscrew the rear cap. There we go, the rear cap comes off. Now the bolt and carrier can come out. There we go, we have to unlock the bolt. That comes out. Then the op rod is going to slide out through the front of the action there. And now I can pull the trigger again, release the barrel, and slide the barrel out the back of the receiver. We then have our bolt carrier here with the extension for the bolt handle. We have the bolt itself, and we have the striker assembly back here. So that's what the firing sear holds onto. There's a quite strong spring with a firing pin inside. And there are a series of grooves on the bolt and cams on the inside of the bolt carrier that force the bolt to rotate as the bolt carrier goes back and forth. So this uses fundamentally the same style of locking system and of bolt as the Schmidt-Rubin straight pulls, also as the M95 Steyr straight pulls, for what it's worth. All right, so when this cycles, the barrel is going to come backward with the bolt locked into it. You have the barrel moving back under recoil directly, and then you have the op rod here, which is pushing on the bolt, and it is being pushed backward by this lug out on the barrel, which is pushing against this front surface of the op rod. So those are going to push the barrel until it's all the way back. Right there, you heard it click. At that point, the bolt locks in place, the barrel returns forward, and then the bolt is able to return forward all the way, locking into battery again. So that's a basic long recoil mechanism. What makes this interesting is instead of just being powered by the barrel moving backwards, we actually have sort of this redundant system of the op rod also pushing the bolt carrier back. We can also see a little bit of the fire control mechanism here, where you have 3 separate springs, and they each control a different element of the fire control system. So this center one is essentially the trigger and sear. This is the release lever for the barrel. When you pull this back, this comes down, which allows the barrel to reciprocate backwards. And then this one is the semi-auto disconnector that gets tripped by the bolt going forward and resets the trigger. All right, so there is your Type 2 Stamm-Saurer prototype rifle. Field stripped, there are a lot of parts in there. This is way more complicated of a rifle than it needs to be, and it's really interesting that you should go back and watch the video on Stamm's first gun, because it was super simple and elegant, and it was 10 plus years before this design. This design is far more complex and expensive to manufacture. The only reason I can think of that they would have gone from a simple gas piston system to a complicated, expensive long recoil design is that long recoil gives you a safety margin that you don't get on other systems. Because the bolt and the barrel are locked together until it's at full end of travel, by that point, pressure in the system in the barrel has dropped to basically nothing. And then the barrel just reciprocates forward under spring pressure. So it's almost impossible to have, you can't have a long recoil system open too early and detonate the way that you can with most other systems. So if you look at long recoil actions that were actually put into production, they're all pretty darn early. They're basically all World War I and earlier systems. You have the Remington Auto 5 shotguns, you have, the Browning Auto 5, you have the Remington Model 8 long recoil sporting rifles, you have the Shosha. These are all very early systems developed when cartridge quality wasn't that great. But does that system make sense for a military rifle in 1912, 1913? No, it really doesn't, and that's, well, let's talk about where this went. So these rifles are being presented for hopeful military adoption circa 1913, going into 1915, and of course, all of the attempts to sell these fall flat because of World War I. The potential sales to the Belgians start in 1913, but those talks fall apart in mid-1914 when, of course, war breaks out, and there are much more pressing things for the Belgian army to do than to try to adopt a really expensive, really complicated new self-loading rifle. After the war, Saurer and Stamm, working together, they'll first submit a light machine gun, and that's a subject for a whole separate video. They will then come back with another self-loading rifle circa, closer to 1920. That's a short recoil design. It also goes nowhere. Ultimately, in 1920, Adolf Saurer dies, and his son, who picks up control of the company after him, just isn't interested in the firearms business and decides to shut down the whole weapons production division. And once again, Hans Stamm is left without a gun company to work for. So ultimately, this batch of long-recoil semi-auto rifles, there's a total of, I believe, 15 manufactured of 3 different patterns, this being, technically speaking, the second pattern. Those differences are really just in furniture and sights. The mechanical system stayed pretty much the same throughout the series. And they end up going nowhere, but they remain a very cool piece of period history for us to take a look at. So this rifle, along with, I believe, 5 other Stamm rifles, are actually on display at the Swiss Shooting Museum in Bern. So if you think this was cool to take a look at, and you find yourself in Switzerland, head over to Bern and take a couple hours and check out the museum, where you can see all of them on the wall on public display. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.